Welcome everyone. I know it's early for some of you, and we are in our last webinar session of this year for the BRT Center of Excellence. Today we have Daniel. He's a professor for the University of Carolina of Chapel Hill, and Erik, he's a PhD candidate. Both of them are going to speak today about built environment support for BRT ridership evidence from Latin America. I hope you like this presentation. If you like it, of course, tell your friends if they want to be in our mailing list and go to see it on our website after all. And now I'll leave you with Daniel and Erik so they can start the presentation. And if you have some questions, you can ask it in the chat room so they can answer after they present.
Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. As Alejandra introduced us, we will be talking about the built environment and BRT today, some of our work in Latin America, and I want to go ahead and present my co-presenter here, introduce him first. Erik Vergel is a Fulbright and Lee Shipper Scholar, and as Alejandra mentioned, he's a doctoral student in the Department of City and Regional Planning at UNC Chapel Hill, hoping to graduate within the next 6 to 8 months. He's currently working on his dissertation project, which examines precisely the topic, the reciprocal relationship between bus rapid transit and the built environment in Latin America. And I'm a professor here in City and Regional Planning, also in Chapel Hill, and my work focuses on studying land development and transportation and the environment and health impacts that follow. And I also direct the Carolina Transportation Program and the Center for Sustainable Community Design at the Institute for the Environment. So just to jump on the action here, here's a roadmap of the next 40 minutes or so. We're going to tell you a little bit about the background and how we got to this topic, what motivated us. Then the methods, we'll tell you our main results, discuss a little bit as we present them, and finally the conclusions. So the background here is that TOD has become increasingly talked about as a policy prescription to help transit and to make cities greener and more sustainable. And so the question is, what is TOD? And we've kind of highlighted some attributes that are important. TOD is development that is compact and dense, that has a high mixture of land uses, that has a pedestrian environment that is very high quality, and that that environment, both for the pedestrian and for the development itself, is very well articulated with the transportation system. It's worth highlighting here that proximity, that is adjacency, is a necessary condition for TOD, so the transit needs to be close to the development. But it's not a sufficient condition. So there has to be more than just adjacency. It has to be adjacency that is designed in a way to promote and facilitate access and egress from the transit system, and at the same time the creation of vibrant centers. So what are some of the benefits of TOD? They tend to make transit more viable for the user by connecting clustered origins and destinations. Frequently, users also benefit from a higher level of service from transit, which means that they're more likely to take transit. For the agency, it provides economies of scale. One type of economy of scale is economy of density, meaning that for the agency, the cost per passenger kilometer, decreases as density goes up because you're able to carry more passengers with the same type of input. It also allows agencies to balance flows. This is an example of Stockholm that over the last 30 or 40 years has aimed explicitly to create clustered development around transit nodes in order to create this balancing that yields an important savings in infrastructure. This savings results simply from better utilizing capacity. So instead of this flow, this tidal flow in and out of a center, which makes these empty backhauls fairly inefficient, balanced flows means that one can move as many passengers as with much less infrastructure. And at the neighborhood level, TOD is also used frequently as a real estate development and really a community development strategy for improvement. So why are we doing this work? Well, what motivated our study is that despite Curitiba's exemplary approach of integrating land development and bus rapid transit, very little is known about TOD around high level of service bus stops, or as we call them here, BRT stops. The perception is that the T in TOD stands for rail most of the time. In other work that we and others have done, we've shown that there's a perceived lack of permanence, that there's a perceived deleterious effects of BRT regarding pollution, mostly air pollution and noise pollution, that conspire against bus-based TOD, that is BRT-oriented development. And so we wanted to see what was happening in most of our Latin American cities around these bus-based improvements. Rail, on the other hand, is frequently presented as a futuristic, as a modern mode in many cities that don't have a metro or aspire to have one, just because it's kind of a leap to the future, rightfully or wrongfully. So we wanted to see what was happening and what would it take to develop in a more TOD-oriented fashion. Another motivation here is that the same is true when we examine the built environment attributes and BRT demand. Indeed, for heavy rail and for light rail, there are many examples and meta-analysis of how the built environment around the stops is related to ridership. You see those two examples right there on the left-hand side for commuter rail, and the middle there for light rail. But much less is known about the built environment and ridership for BRT, except a couple of studies, one that we did in Bogota, and there's another study in LA. So it's really an open field for researchers and practitioners to think about how we build our cities and how they could be oriented towards bus rapid transit. So given this context and given this motivation, we wanted to focus our questions. What's ironic too is, or interesting, is that Latin America has been leading the deployment of BRT, and so there's a great opportunity to see what's been happening in Latin America. Our first focus, our first aim, was to understand what is occurring around BRT stops. So this is merely descriptive, and we more specifically wanted to examine the built environment around BRT stops, and through that examination, hopefully try to develop a typology of environments to help understand what are the different types that exist out there, and maybe think about guiding decision makers towards possible future scenarios, what they can aspire to, and what can they do to make that environment a little better. And the second aim, so our presentation really has two pieces. The first one is that kind of describe the environment, and the second one is, now we've described the environment and know how it looks like and what's there, try to associate that built environment or those features to actual station level demand, station level use. Looking at individual cities in some cases, you'll see a few results from that, and then understand also the overall effects. So I've gone through the background and the motivation. Let me quickly turn to the methods, because I think the meat of the presentation is really in the details here as we move forward. So we collected this stop level data, as you might imagine, for many cities in Latin America. We began this project in 2011, and it's been ongoing for the last 3 to 4 years. At the time, in 2011, we wanted to have BRT systems that had been in operation for at least 5 years. Why is this? Well, because we thought that any type of land development impacts of the BRT, some of them were anticipated, some take a little more time to happen. 5 years was the minimum. Ideally would have been 15, 20 years, but of course we only have that type of time or lag for only a couple of cities. And we also did not want to focus on very small cities, so we wanted medium to large cities. In the end, we picked 7 cities in Latin America. They represented, as of 2012, 16% of the world's BRT use and 31% of the use or the demand for BRT in Latin America. So again, we kind of went broad because we really wanted to generalize and understand what's happening in the entire continent as opposed to just in a single city. We wanted also to identify stops that had a variety of conditions. So we didn't want to find the stops that were only kind of the best examples, because that would certainly give us a biased sense of what was happening. Instead, we wanted ones that would give us a sense of how we're doing overall. In other words, some good stops, some stops that were not very BRT oriented or that didn't have those features. As we picked stops, we also talked to local planners who in many cases confirmed our choices. In other cases suggested, well, this other stop is actually a little better in terms of highlighting a condition that we wanted to understand. What you see in this table here is ultimately what we ended up doing. Overall, we examined 88 stops and 32 terminals. Terminals are what we consider the end-of-line stops for many of these systems. And you see here how they broke down by each of the different cities. For smaller systems like Ciudad de Guatemala, Guatemala City, this meant assessing more than 50% of all the system stops. And for Guayaquil in Ecuador, that meant also assessing about 3/4 of the terminals of the system. For larger systems, if you look at Curitiba, you look at Bogota, for example, our analysis is going to cover a smaller percentage of the terminals and the stops. So what to collect? In considering what data to collect, we were guided by prior framework and prior work identifying what they have called the 5 Ds, shown here in the left box. There's no need to repeat them. In addition to those 5 Ds, from density to distance, we wanted a little more specificity, partly because we think local planners are often driven by more concrete recommendations than just simply saying, well, you need to have a diversity of uses. That's often too general. So we analyzed some specific elements that we thought were hypothesized were going to be important, like number 6 here, parking, like the pedestrian infrastructure. This is particularly important for TOD, and it's not, it's kind of buried into the 5 Ds, not very explicit. Socioeconomic characteristics, partly because we were interested in gentrification, and this is a topic that we're not going to talk about here today, but Erik is developing his dissertation. Very tangible for many of the cities, both in Latin America and the rest of the world. And we were interested also in public spaces and facilities. When I say public spaces and facilities, I'm talking about community centers, health centers, plazas, green spaces, hospitals, parks, and the like. So this is what we collected, and I want to show you how we did it. We looked at the environment around each stop. For those non-terminal stops, which are this kind of simple stops or regular stops, we looked at an area within 250 meters. And I must say up front that I wished we would looked at 500 meters, but as you'll see, the scope of this data collection was such that we had to focus on a narrower area just because of the data we needed to collect. For terminals, which often have a broader catchment area and there's transfers, intermodal transfers and feeders, we looked at a broader area, 500 meters, which meant about 0.8 square kilometers. In some cases, we had some stops that overlapped, mostly in Guatemala City, and so you see those examples here in the image. You don't have a neat buffer, but you have kind of a figure 8, if you will, by the areas covered by these stops. In terms of the details of the data collection, we've modified something called the Pedestrian Environment Data Scan. This is a tool that has been used in a variety of different countries. We participated in the development of this tool, in the validation of this tool. We modified it for this current application. Data was collected at the road segment level or the block level. So what you see here in the blue columns, sort of vertically, are segments. And so what is a road segment? A segment is a piece of a street that is between 2 intersections. And so a person walks along the segment and they record the features observed in these columns. The red horizontal arrow on the lower left-hand side shows data collected at the block level. Mostly facilities, schools, health centers, libraries, marketplaces, places of worship, but also some things like greenways, bicycle lanes, cycle tracks, and so on. Things that mattered, in our view, more at the block level rather than necessarily at the segment level. All of this data was collected by Erik, and so he certainly deserves kudos and a shout out for this incredible effort, except for Guatemala, in which Erik participated in training local staff to collect this data. In addition to this very detailed information, we also used secondary data at the stop level. The secondary data included population, roads, distance to the central business district. So what were the areas audited in the results? Here's sort of a first set of descriptive findings that are of interest. The red circles, the ones in the bottom here, show the relatively high density of segments and blocks around stops. Again, recall that we're looking at an area of 0.2 square kilometers for the stops. So a place like Guatemala City has 100 segments within those 0.2 square kilometers. So it's a very well-connected fabric. Guayaquil had almost 30 blocks per stop, which is also fairly significant. This is, of course, strongly associated with where the stops were placed at the beginning when the system was designed and the type of pre-existing development that was there. The green circles show the opposite, however. Relatively low densities, which really means long street segments, not many of those, not very interrupted by intersections, not very well connected, and fairly large blocks. When I add the data to the right-hand side of this table, the same two cities that had high segment and block density are there, Guatemala City and Guayaquil. But Bogota also climbs up to the top, which is interesting. And this story is a little different than before because it suggests that terminals, which are fairly new in Bogota, have developed in slightly different ways than the stops. They're more connected and the blocks are smaller. Contrast that to Curitiba, that also had new development at terminals, but it actually has a similar kind of low pattern of connectivity that this table is suggesting. So given all this data, how do we aggregate it? Well, for the data that we collected, the segment level, that's at the street level, we simply aggregated it as a percentage of the segments in the stop. At the block level, we looked at the density or count of what happened. And then we have some stop level data, like we mentioned density or population density or road density that we use as a continuous variable. I want to clarify that for a second here. These two figures describe best how we aggregated the data. On the left, you have land uses for a given stop. And these land uses, we collected them at the segment level. So we went along and said, what's commercial, what's residential, when is there a mix? And when we aggregate that to the stop, which is the circle, the buffer that you see here, we would get the percentage of segments, for example, that mix commercial and residential. And those are shown in red in this very specific buffer. Those were segment or block faces that mix commercial and residential uses. On the right-hand side, you see data that we collected at the block level. And so the way we aggregated it to the stop was simply by counting the number of parks or squares around the stop area. In this case, those green bubbles would represent one block, one park in that block. So we simply made a count, and in this case, we would have 10 or 12 or 15 parks for that specific block. So given all this sort of complex data, we went ahead and for the first aim, which is sort of to understand what's there and develop a typology, we used two statistical techniques. First, we used factor analysis to reduce our data to a lower number of factors, and then we used cluster analysis to come up with the different cluster, or the different group types for all of our 88 stops and 33 terminals. And for the second aim, which is, again, associating demand with the built environment features, we simply ran a regression model. What you see here in the screen is Curitiba. Those small blue bars are I believe are the ridership for each of the stops, and you see in yellow and red the population density in persons per hectare for each of the stops. So that gives you a sense of the association between density and ridership for, in this case, Curitiba. But that's ultimately what we ended up doing for all of them, while controlling for a number of different characteristics. So it ended up being a multivariate regression model. You'll hear about our results in a second. And with this, we'll go into the detailed elements of the presentation, the results. Erik will continue. You might have a second or two of a white screen as we transfer the presentation role to him. Erik.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Daniel, for the introductions and a wonderful presentation, giving all the background and the methodology used in this project. I'm going to explain the results. Here we have a descriptive statistics of the sample of 120 BRT stations or stops. We can see here how the values about density, which means the built-up area or the building, building heights, are not so high across the sample. And at the same time, we see how parking, not only parking on the street, but also parking associated with land use, commercial land uses, are fairly high, which means we found an important presence of parking, not only associated with commercial land uses, but also on the street, close to the BRT stations and the BRT terminals. The little amount of vacant land, especially those segments that are along the BRT corridors, are very low, which suggests these BRT systems are usually built along consolidated areas in these cities. But we see how population densities are significantly high, which suggests also how in the design process of BRT systems, population density is an important variable in the design and the implementation of the mass transit system. So when we look at the typologies that we identified after looking at the built environment factors, and then based on the built environment factors, we classified stations. We found, we're going to discuss only 5 cluster or typologies, but we found 13 typologies. The typology 4 or cluster 4 suggests stations that have physical barriers in terms of the large size of blocks, which makes it difficult for pedestrians to reach stations. And usually you have not only institutional but also industrial land uses, and even the BRT corridor becomes a barrier in terms of crossing the BRT trunk corridor. The cluster number 5 is the one that we found the closest to what transit-oriented development could be in this context. This one is characterized by high population densities. You have a good amount of pedestrian infrastructure, green open spaces, and facilities that are extremely important in terms of the location close to the stations, considering that facilities are the main destinations for passengers in the system. Cluster 6 is a historic center type, which means BRT stations located in historic centers. I'm going to explain that in more detail in a second. But it's a unique type of stop, especially for the high concentration of pedestrian infrastructure. And we found a cluster that is close to transit-oriented development in terms of having high densities, high multifamily developments or high-rise developments, but the orientation could be higher towards the system, and I'm going to explain that in a second. And finally, we found another typology, cluster 11, which is the type of station that usually is on the periphery of cities, where you still have some vacant land, and therefore there are many green spaces in that area. There are some institutional land uses which are usually associated with facilities that the government is providing at those locations, and but these ones are areas where there is still a space for future developments in close proximity to the stations or BRT terminals. So when we look at the historic center type, this is the Plaza Grande BRT station in Quito. The historic center of Quito is part of the World Heritage List by UNESCO, and these streets that are close to the station are pedestrian streets. So this environment, as we can see here with the mean value of non-motorized transport infrastructure, the value is high, the mean value of this typology is high, suggesting that there is a strong pedestrian environment in close proximity to the BRT station. And as a result of the presence of institutional and facilities land uses in this area, here you have the city government buildings, the national government buildings. There are many administrative buildings that are important destinations for many people commuting downtown Quito or the historic center of Quito. And here we see how the mean value is also high if we compare with other typologies in the sample. This is the type of built environment you have. In this picture on the right, you see here is the access to the BRT station. This is the pedestrian environment that you have close to the BRT stop. And this is the type of environment you see this is a highly connected environment across the typologies, and therefore is unique. We couldn't find any other station like that one in the sample. The typology that has a potential to become TOD, you find there is a concentration of high-rise multifamily developments with a mixture of commercial and residential. Vacant land is not high in this sample, but you see at the same time the population density is high. So what we see here is the land has been developed in terms of high-rise developments and a mixture of land uses, but there are some areas like pedestrian infrastructure that are not high in this sample of stops, and they could be improved in order to make this environment more pedestrian friendly and connected to transit. This is the type of one of the examples we have here is Station Jardín Botánico in Curitiba. This is a facility that is next to the BRT station here, and you see here the high-rise developments, but pedestrian infrastructure is not as high as we saw it in the historic center of Quito, for instance. When we look at the typology of open space stations, which are usually located in the periphery of cities, this is the case of BRT Terminal Usme in Bogotá, which is here in the south of the whole urban area. We see how there is a high concentration of vacant land, so there are development opportunities. You also have here non-core residential land uses, and these ones are low building heights, mostly affordable housing developments or informal settlements that are close to the BRT terminal, and you also see high population densities in this type of environment. So this is basically a trade-off between providing transportation infrastructure at the periphery, where probably the development that you have around is not so high, but you are also opening a market for developers who have the opportunity to provide affordable housing, which is what is happening right now in this BRT terminal. The picture on the right shows the bus rapid transit system infrastructure on the right, and on the left there are new developments of affordable housing, and at the back you can see the informal settlements. I'm going to discuss in a little bit the implications of that concentration of affordable housing and informal settlements in relation to the number of passengers per day for the system. So moving to the discussion, we can see how the typology captures some specific factors, like the case of Quito and the historic center BRT station, which is unique. The built environment in that historic center is highly pedestrian, and as a result there is no any other BRT station in the sample that is similar to a high concentration of pedestrian infrastructure, mixture of land uses and institutional facilities, all concentrated in such a unique area. In the case of Guatemala, Ciudad de Guatemala, the typology, the cluster 10, captures the typology of a station that is combining two stations that are paired in the same way that Daniel explained before. You have the station on one block, and 1 block away the other station. So you have like twin or sister stations, and therefore the buffer area is not a complete circle. It's a merge of two circles, and that was captured by the analysis of the typology. So this is a unique typology. Guatemala has its own type of built environment, probably associated with the high density of segments that Daniel explained before. And we also have a cluster, the cluster 8 or typology 8, which has grouped 21 BRT terminals. So in the analysis, we also confirmed how BRT terminals are different, not only because they concentrate the demand in the system, but also because the built environment around terminals makes them a unique typology in this sample. So in terms of the discussion and the surprises as a result of this typology classification, we have as I mentioned before, there is a high amount of parking on and off a street, usually associated with commercial land uses. There is still a low density across the sample, so we believe there are still opportunities to increase densities. Not only we're talking about here population density, we're talking about here built-up area, and probably this is related to how the systems have been introduced in already developed areas, but there is also opportunities for higher densities or development opportunities in the future, which are related to redevelopment, regeneration, revitalization efforts as a result of a little vacant land. In terms of the mixture of land uses, the entropy measurement that we developed, looking at the mixture of land uses of institutional, commercial, and residential, is 0.64, which is high if you compare with cities in the United States like San Francisco or Chicago. Basically what we see here is a mixture of land uses that we don't know if they are a result of a planning process, or perhaps this is a dynamic that is taking place in cities in Latin America, where we know the mixture of land uses is usually a result of opportunities to have commercial spaces and uses in former or previous residential properties, especially as a result of having a high concentration of passengers coming in and out the system. Some attributes that we identify that are important as part of the discussion are the type of residential. We have multifamily developments in close proximity to BRT, but sometimes these ones are not associated with high level of transit orientation, which suggests probably that the multifamily developments are taking place as a development opportunity by developers, but perhaps there is an absence of land use policies that are trying to connect these multifamily residential developments with pedestrian infrastructure and transit investments. So probably this is related to high levels of parking, high density with pedestrian support. This is an important connection. We found it in the case of the Historic Center of Quito, and we believe it's an important connection to support the system. We're going to see that in a second. And institutional uses and green spaces is an important attribute or connection relationship that we found, especially for those BRT stations and terminals that I described before, where you have development opportunities and you can encourage or promote development with the location of facilities that can help to promote more developments, especially for affordable housing, as I'm going to explain in a second. So there is also an important presence of low-income groups in terms of affordable housing and informal settlements, and the barriers that I discussed before are industrial land uses, which imply large blocks, reducing the connectivity around the stations. This is an example of industrial land uses. Here we have a BRT station on industrial land uses in Bogota, or Sesion in Curitiba, which is a BRT station in industrial areas where connectivity is not easy as a result of these large blocks and low pedestrian infrastructure. The results in terms of population density suggest that there is a positive association between population density and ridership in Curitiba. We found an elasticity of 0.26, which suggests a double in the population density, suggests a 26% increase in ridership. This is close to what other authors have found in light rail systems in the United States. When we look at ridership and entropy, which is a mixture of land uses, we also see that there is a positive association, and we can predict an increase in the number of passengers per day. The same happens with the presence of high-rise developments. We're talking about here developments that are more than 5 stories. We can see also an increase in the predictions of number of passengers per day. When we look at the non-motorized transport infrastructure, we also see an increase, a positive association between ridership and the presence of non-motorized transport infrastructure. And we also checked an association between high-rise developments and BRT terminals, and we also see a significant increase in ridership. This is, of course, number of passengers per day, suggesting that because BRT terminals concentrate a high amount of the demand in the system, the presence of high-rise developments could also have a significant change and increase in ridership. When we look at the factors, and I apologize, we don't have time here to discuss all the built environment factors, but when we look at the association between these built environment factors and ridership, two factors that include transit-oriented development features, which are factor 1 and 8, they are positively associated with BRT ridership, which suggests this type of environment around stations support the system in terms of the number of passengers per day. When we look at factor 5, which is characterized by non-core single residential, low building heights, these are mostly residential areas located on the periphery or far from the city center, the association is negative. So here we see how the contrast between the type of environment we have a positive or negative association with BRT ridership. And finally, when we look at the analysis of the percent change of ridership for these typologies in relation to the reference category, which is C4, this is the typology that we identified before as the barrier typology, which has industrial areas, low densities. So this typology is the typology that we consider the lowest in terms of transit orientation. And if we compare the results of all typologies in relation to this one, we find that typology 5, which is TOD orientation, has a significant change on ridership, and this is statistically significant. In orange, you have all results that are statistically significant. The historic center in Quito typology also has an increase in a percentage change in ridership. This is the typology C7, is the typology of TOD orientation, but not completely oriented to transit. There is still room for pedestrian infrastructure. We also see a positive association and percentage change. BRT terminals, of course, they concentrate the demand, and therefore we can see 3 times an increase in BRT ridership in this typology. And I want to highlight this one, which is typology 12, cluster 12, in which we have all the stations that concentrate affordable housing, informal settlements, but they still have high densities as a result of this type of housing. We also see a percentage change increase in ridership, which is different from what we see for the typology 11, C12 cluster 11, which is open space areas, where there is still vacant land. This confirms the negative association or no association between vacant land and ridership. So some conclusions to close this presentation are, we identified a typology which is empirically based. It's highly descriptive, but it's based on data collected around transit, both rapid transit stations. We identified opportunities and barriers for development. We found, for instance, the presence of parking, the importance of redevelopment measures, the importance of having pedestrian infrastructure to get access to these stations and terminals. We also identified there is a positive association of population density with the number of passengers in the system, but this is not enough if you want to achieve high levels of ridership. So what we are looking at here is how population density is important, but it's not only the unique aspect to look at when we design both rapid transit systems. The built environment is playing an important role, and those characteristics of the built environment that define transit-oriented development, like pedestrian infrastructure, mixture of land uses, high-rise developments, are positively associated with the number of passengers per day in this sample. Some characteristics that we identified in the typologies around these stations with positive associations with the ridership levels are, as I mentioned before, the presence of high-rise developments that combine multifamily with commercial developments, usually commercial on the first floor, the mixture of commercial, residential, and institutional land uses. These institutional land uses usually located along the trunk corridor, so users can reach destinations in an easier way. This proximity is an important aspect, and also building heights more than 5 stories around or in close proximity to a station. So we believe there is an important aspect in the planning stage for BRT systems. It's important to have land use regulations that are going to encourage the attributes that we identified here that are positively associated with ridership. We also believe it's important to work with people who own the land or they are living in close proximity to these stations. In terms of implementation, we believe it's important to promote high-density developments with a high-quality non-motorized transport infrastructure to provide better access to stations and terminals. These land use regulations should focus on redevelopment, considering that these systems have been introduced in already developed areas and the importance of having public spaces well connected to stations in terms of improving the local accessibility. We want to acknowledge the support from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, the Lee Shipper Memorial Scholarship, and the Institute for the Study of the Americas, and all these individuals and organizations who supported data collection, data processing, data manipulation, and providing the results. We appreciate your time, and now we are looking forward for your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik and Daniel. That was a very good presentation. Everyone, if you have some questions, you can ask them in the chat. We don't take them home, ask them now. I think there's a lot of information in this presentation, and if you want to ask something, don't be shy and do it so. While we wait, Daniel, do you want to say a final comment after Erik's presentation?
Yeah, I mean, I thank you. Yes, Alejandra. I would say that now maybe a couple years since we've been starting working on this, several years, of course, bus rapid transit has become even more prevalent, and not only in Latin America, but sort of the rapid diffusion elsewhere suggests to me that there are very important lessons that are transferable to other cities. And in fact, Erik has worked a little bit on the India case as part of some related work to also make sure that, or to identify what lessons could be transferred, understanding that, of course, every city is slightly different. We found it here in the analysis with Guatemala City, with some of the Brazilian examples, and undoubtedly, the cities in India were quite different in many respects, but there were also some commonalities that I think were of interest. So I think there's a sort of a broader appeal here to think not only of BRT as a sort of a mobility provider, but also as a strategy for making our cities greener and development that is more sustainable and that also kind of feeds on each other, sort of like a virtuous cycle as opposed to a vicious cycle, one that is beneficial to residents and to the transit providers.
Yeah, now we have 4 questions. I don't know if you are seeing them, Erik and Daniel.
We don't see them, Alejandra, so if you don't mind just reading them out loud.
Of course. Yeah. Juan Pablo Forrero asks, do you think those numbers can be used to model future development as a tool for planners and decision makers to take action in future corridors, urban developments?
We can go ahead and answer, and I can sort of give you a sense. My suggestion is yes, absolutely. The way the modeling has gone in several parts of the world is now you normally have 2 types of models applied. One is exactly what we did here, which is kind of a reduced form regression model, a station level regression model. of course, BRT investments are such that they are modifying the network. They are having important network effects for the city, and so often some sort of regional transportation model, four-step model, is also run. But invariably, my impression is that often the station-level models, particularly when the change, where the intervention is not huge, not dramatic, maybe one line, but not 5 lines. So I perhaps wouldn't do it for Santiago that comfortably, but I would probably do it for other cities that are doing it so more incrementally. Do a better job in predicting ridership than the 4-step model. And so I think that rather than a substitute, I would say that it's definitely a good complement, and it's likely to provide a great tool for planners. Certainly some of the R-squares, Erik didn't mention this, he's controlling for many other attributes as he was showing those graphs. And the percentage of the variation in the data that's explained was invariably above 50% and sometimes as high as 80%. In many of his models. So there seemed to be a fairly good fit, and what's surprising is, again, we're talking about 7 different cities, so there's also some heterogeneity in there. He was controlling for some city fixed effects as well, but it was remarkable to get the fairly high R-square. So I agree that's a great possibility.
Juan Pablo has a replicate, and he has, but it is available to the public.
Let me explain the final report with this work is posted on the Lee Shipper Memorial Scholarship website, so anyone can get access to the report. And we are now working on a version to be published in a journal, so we want everyone to get access to that version as well. But at the moment, anyone can get access to the report on the Lee Shipper Memorial website.
Yeah. Thank you, Juan Pablo. Now we're going for Chris Segra's question. How generalizable do you think your results are to TOD more generally in Latin America? In, for example, rail base?
I think that's a great question. Oops. Yeah. Okay. I thought I was mute. I think it's a great question. I mean, that's an empirical question. We think that it's not going to be that different for rail, but that's just a hypothesis. It would be fairly easy. This is not to suggest that the work that we've done thus far is easy, because it was very labor intensive and very deliberate. But with the advent of Street View permeating, sort of Google Street View permeating many of our cities, and several different studies suggesting that sort of desktop data collection seems to be fairly valid and reliable, as opposed to Erik or I walking the segments over and over again. I think that it's doable in the future. Personally, I don't think that there's going to be a lot of difference with rail. In terms of the typology, but I think to be honest, what we found here was that there wasn't a strong transit orientation for many of the segments, and I think that reflects mostly how engineers, who are the dominant planners for BRT, tend to view BRT, and it's just routed through the place where we're going to hit the highest demand, and that often means going through fairly consolidated parts of the city. So in some ways, it's a description of reality. In other ways, it's kind of saying, here are some of the limitations that we're seeing by the way BRT is being planned. And Curitiba being a very, very noticeable exception. We did include some stops of the Línea Verde in Curitiba, which is a deliberate attempt at balancing the need to have enough demand with the desire to induce development that is more transit-oriented and that is much easier to do in greenfield areas or areas that are underused, underutilized, as opposed to very consolidated areas. And so that's an interesting example that we're kind of watching over time. But this is a great future study.
Yeah, for everyone, the document is uploaded. If you want to download the document, the reports of the scholarship. So, and Erik sent the link in the chat if you also want to download it. Now going to the next question. Carrie sent this question. Do you have any recommendations for a strategy for building high-density housing surrounding BRT stations? And did you find any patterns of land ownership, public, private, etc., around these stations?
Okay, thank you. This is a very good question. I think the recommendation we have is we should have a baseline. The baseline should be for future stations and current stations. If you have a future station, we should look at what is around that future station and contrast with the findings of this study. Based on that, we can decide what measurements you need around future stations, and maybe if the location of that station is appropriate for what we can expect in terms of predictions of ridership based on the results of this study. And for current stations, we also need a baseline data that is looking at what we did here with this study, which is looking at what is around the stations, and based on that, determine the type of density that we should encourage or promote around the stations. For instance, the high-density housing surrounding BRT stations that we suggest would be multifamily housing, but mixed with commercial land uses, especially commercial land uses on the first floor.
And I would like to add one more thing, and it's the graph that Erik showed with high-density developments and then developments that are more than 5 stories high, that they kind of behaved and tracked very closely throughout the entire data. And that, to me, suggested that the strategy to achieve density could be through sort of hyperdensity, sort of the very tall buildings that some cities are trying to encourage, that is frequently accompanied by a lot of empty space around them, either because of access issues, parking, et cetera, or through, I think, more human scale density that is 6, 7 stories, 8 stories, much more compact, not necessarily hyperdensity, but much more evenly distributed. So maybe a little more the Scandinavian approach to densifying. And what was interesting is that both seem to have very similar effects on ridership. They were not very distinct.
Yeah, thank you. Now we're going with Fernando's question. Thanks for the presentation. I understand the importance for working with locally landowners and tenants. How do you foresee working with informal settlements residents without creating concern for their homes?
Well, I think this is a question that is related to what extent the transportation investment it's also related to upgrading the built environment. What we know in the case of Bogota is that the BRT investment included the improvement of the built environment in those areas where you have low income groups. So what I believe, and according to the results, is even if you don't have an upgraded, improved built environment, you can also expect a high level of ridership just because you have affordable housing or low-income groups located close to BRT stations. So, in my point of view, the work with low-income groups should be looking at how the built environment can be improved, some slum upgrading measures that are going to provide better access to low-income groups to the stations, and to what extent the BRT investment, the transportation investment, is not only looking at the transportation infrastructure, but at the same time, there will be coordination with investments that are going to increase pedestrian infrastructure, which is usually a problem in those areas, the presence of facilities, that is also a problem in those areas, and also how the network of this non-motorized transport provide better access to these low-income groups to the BRT station. So this is the type of work in which the transportation investment should look at the built environment as well, and working with low-income groups in terms of what they need. So the importance of looking at the needs they have, especially when they have the knowledge of what they are the needs or the important investments that are needed in those areas.
And I would add one quick comment here. In Bogota, in other work that also has been published recently, we found that vehicle ownership decreased, or the likelihood that people would motorize decreased in medium and low to medium income areas that were more BRT friendly, that were better integrated towards the BRT, as opposed to areas that were more auto-oriented or more removed. And so we're seeing that this that BRT in some cases is a substitute for motorization, both motorcycles and private automobiles, but that synergy, if you will, occurs only when the built environment is supporting it. Regarding affordable housing, I mean, this is, in my view, a double-edged sword, because undoubtedly what's happening is what Erik described. There are some local improvements. The case of Quitumbe in Quito is very telling. There was affordable housing occurring in the south of the city, and as soon as the BRT came, prices increased so much that there was no opportunity to provide any more affordable housing because it was just not feasible for developers to provide it. They would just move to sort of medium income housing. So for existing residents, that was a great story, right? Their property values appreciated, and they're now going to be surrounded by higher income families that will likely yield very positive outcomes, social outcomes for them. On the other hand, as a public policy, you just priced out yourself of an area where you wanted to provide affordable housing, or where you could provide affordable housing, not any longer. And so now the choice set is much smaller because you need to think about it. And the broader discussion here is most of our Latin American cities are still providing affordable housing in the periphery, requiring these very long transportation times for low-income residents. And when the fare is not integrated, we're talking about also very high costs. And that's something that's certainly not addressed in our research, but is of increasing relevance.
Thank you. And for the last two questions, they are both from David. First, he asks, did you look at the quality or cost of the BRT service? While higher quality BRT, more comfortable, more frequent, more exclusive station with more amenities, attracts more riders and perhaps more development, it also costs more and reduces the cost advantage of BRT compared to LRT Metro. And he also asks, land use policy is important, as you shown, but is there anything else that can be done to encourage high-quality TOD in absence of a good municipality TOD policy?
This is also a good question. We did not include the quality of service in the analysis or the cost of the service, and as part of our recommendations, we believe this is an important variable or group of variables that they should be included. And we also believe the analysis should be longitudinal on time. So perhaps we can look at this type of variables like quality of service and the cost of the BRT over time and look at these characteristics over time to see how perhaps the BRT had any influence on changes in the built environment. Because perhaps in the case like the BRT terminal in Bogota, Usme, we see how the investment on transportation opened a big market for developers, and now you see affordable housing developments taking place. So this is like a chicken and egg question, and I believe we can include those variables in the future, but I strongly believe it's important to understand the quality of service, and the cost can be also looked in terms of an analysis over time.
And I wanted to add, David, thank you for the very good question. On the second part of your question, what happens when you have a municipality that maybe is not on board, that maybe doesn't have the capacity to provide the land planning? There is the private sector, and to me what was sobering was in about 2007 when we met with a real estate folks at Carrefour. This was sort of the largest French retailer. At the time they were in Colombia. They have since left and opened it and sold their businesses to a Chilean company, in fact. But the real estate director of Carrefour could recite without having to look anywhere. He knew in his head where all the BRT stops of all the BRT systems in Colombia implemented to that moment, to 2008, had been built. And where were their assets, their stores, their big box retail places relative to each of the stops. And so he would tell me, oh, that stop there, no, we're actually already consolidating, we're buying land. Oh, that other stop, no, we have a store about 3 blocks away from there. That other stop, too little ridership. The private sector knew ahead of time, much ahead than the public sector, that this was a cash cow. And I think that there's a real possibility for, in this case, transit planners to, as you suggest, sort of, well, bypass the municipal planners if they're not on board, if they're not willing to do it, and work with the private sector. This is particularly true for commercial development that benefits from bypassers, from pedestrian flows, but also for affordable housing developers that frequently realize that this is probably the only way in which their development could be feasible for lower income individuals, because you're going to provide fairly decent transit access. And yes, the cost issue is huge, and ultimately I think Latin America's move away from thinking about BRT as self-sustaining financially is absolutely the good one. And to the extent that we think about BRT as a continuum of modes where you can look more like an LRT with the type of interventions that LRT requires, more urban interventions, or you can view it more as a traditional bus that is much more pedestrian, if you will, much more regular, I think we'll be better served.
We don't have any other questions, so if you want to say a final remark before we close the session.
Well, thank you for the great questions, for the patient audience. Again, Erik sent a link to his shipper report that looked at the ridership models. So I encourage you to look at it if you're more interested. Alejandra, thank you again for joining us, and again to the Center of Excellence for inviting us and for convening this audience.
No, thank you both for this presentation. I thought I enjoyed it very much. I hope everyone else enjoyed it. It will be uploaded in our website in a few days. So have a nice holidays and Christmas and New Year, everyone, with their families, and I hope we'll have you in the next webinar session. So regards, and we'll see you again in a few months. Thank you, everyone.